Hello, and welcome back to our podcast series, Domestic Workers Organizing for Legal Change in Asia. In this episode, we continue to look at region wide trends. Almost two-thirds of domestic workers remain fully excluded from national labor laws in Asia, and the ratification of international labor conventions is notably lower than in other parts of the world. Yet, domestic workers play an essential role in meeting direct and indirect care needs of households across Asia. How can we leverage the increasing attention on the care economy to push for change? We're very excited to have Rebecca Napier Moore with us today. She's a technical officer at the International Labour Organization and has deep expertise on the labour conditions, legal protections, and organizing strategies of domestic workers across the region. We discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to laws and policies for domestic workers. We learn about some of the social, economic, and political developments reshaping the legal landscape across Asia. Thank you so much again, Rebecca, for agreeing to do the podcast. It's really good to have you here. So, just to start us off, could you tell us a bit about the International Labour Organization's work related to domestic workers in Asia?
Sure. So first of all, we're grounded in research. And in the last few years, we've done studies on legal progress since Convention 189, the Domestic Workers Convention. We've done policy gap analyses to see what needs to change in a country's laws for the country to comply with C189. We've done studies looking at working conditions in the sector, skill levels in the sector. So asking domestic workers what tasks they're actually doing and then matching that up with internationally agreed skills classification. Then we've looked at levels of recruitment costs for migrant domestic workers and appetite for social security inclusion among domestic workers and their employers. So all of these we're doing with domestic workers' involvement, which is really key for us. And from there, we work with domestic workers to advocate for change. So we hold fora with policymakers and media for domestic workers to get their messages out. Last year, for instance, in Thailand, domestic workers talked with the Social Security Office staff a few times and its board members. And then also, we hugely support domestic workers organizing in current associations or unions, as well as the formation of new groups. So I'm excited to tell you that in Myanmar, there is establishment of a new domestic worker association. And in Malaysia, there have been formation of new groups, and Singapore. So all within the last 3 years, quite a lot of progress in organizing that we've been able to support, but domestic workers are really doing it. And then we're promoting policy change and countries' ratification of C189. And sometimes this is advocacy, sometimes technical advice on laws when governments ask us for our help. And sometimes it's getting all the parties around the table through tripartite dialogues.
Okay, fantastic. So you spoke a lot about work related to Convention 189, and I had noticed that in Asia, there's actually a very low level of ratification. So could you tell us what you think the reasons could be for this?
Sure, it's hard to say exactly what reasons are, but one reason is that overall, Asia's level of ratification of any international labor convention is low. So not just ratification levels for C189 specifically. And if you look within the region, East Asia and the Pacific are ratifying at a significantly lower rate than the rest of Asia. Several countries in the last couple of years have started to ratify some conventions, mostly the fundamental conventions around freedom of association, collective bargaining, forced and child labor, discrimination, and OSH. And they've started doing this after these long periods of what we call ratification drought. So hopefully, hopefully there is some momentum gaining. More specific to C189, however, is the lack of recognition of domestic work as real work in the region. We did a study a few years back looking at discourse in Southeast Asia, where domestic workers are called helpers, aunties, maids, not workers. And when you start from there, even looking at what wording is used in national languages, terminology can get pretty demeaning and rarely signifying that domestic workers are squarely workers with rights to an 8-hour workday, to minimum wage, etc. So without seeing domestic workers as workers, there's little progress to extend labor protections in the sector, and then from there to ratify C189.
So there's this low level of ratification, but that aside, like, have you seen that there have been any major shifts that have occurred in different countries since Convention 189 came into place? And I don't know if this would be too much to ask, but could you say that these changes that came in place are related to the adoption of C189?
Sure. So I think in the Philippines we can probably say we can probably see a relation to C189. Um, so in the Philippines in 2013, after ratifying C189, um, the government adopted comprehensive legislation for domestic workers, recognizing domestic work as a formal labor sector, requiring a contract, minimum wage, and employer paid social security coverage. So I think that one we can um, point to a change after the convention. Then there's a couple of other things I can talk about, recent changes we've seen that may not necessarily be related. So um, one is in Malaysia recently, the legal term domestic servants had been on the books for a long time and really set the scene for negative social norms. And this was changed to domestic employees. So that's a win. Also in Malaysia, Social Security has recently been extended to domestic workers, which is a huge change from the Social Security office there. And this is in a country where employers are still not legally obliged to pay minimum wage. So that's the fact that their Social Security is really great. Another thing that's changed in recent years has been a change to restrictions on migration for domestic work. And in 2017, we did a study in the ILO on gender related bans on women moving within Southeast Asia to seek paid work. So, moving for labor migration. Um, and at that time, several countries that we were looking at, Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, PDR, all had various kinds of bans on women moving, and uh, including bans on moving for domestic work. So, a few years on, now I'm happy to say that almost all of these countries, except the Philippines, which still has a couple of restrictions, nearly all the countries have removed the bans on migration for domestic work and are working to increase the labor protections for women migrant domestic workers, doing this through MOUs or other bilateral agreements.
So these legal changes that have come about have happened, would you say, because of the organizing efforts of domestic workers? Because you mentioned in the beginning how you work with closely with domestic worker organizations and movements for advocacy. So could you tell us a bit more about what the organizing scene across Asia looks like? Have there been any difference or trends in organizing in Asia?
Yes, okay. October 26th is day 73 of Indonesian domestic workers' hunger strike. Our friends at the National Network on Domestic Worker Advocacy, which is called JALA PRT for acronym. Um, so our domestic worker leader friends in Indonesia and other domestic worker groups are hunger striking for the government to pass the Domestic Workers Protection Bill. This is something that the deliberation on the bill began in May. The bill was first proposed almost 20 years ago in 2004. And the bill would insist on written contracts, it would penalize violence, it would create an avenue for complaints, and then introduce rights to training, health insurance, and social security. So the workers are really insisting now. They've called for this for a long time, and finally have gotten to the place where hunger striking is the last resort to get this bill passed. Activists on the ground say they're really hopeful that their efforts are going to work and that the bill will pass. Amazingly, however, the bill still does not set a minimum wage or maximum hours for domestic workers. So lots of new protections, but not everything. You asked me also about laws across the region earlier. So I'll segue a little bit to some findings from a review we did for the 10th anniversary of C189. And we have seen that in Asia and the Pacific, 61.5% of domestic workers remain fully excluded from labor laws. And on the other hand, no country is fully including them in general labor laws. So countries have instead tended to adopt specific laws on the sector, just like Indonesia is looking to do. And while this approach can be seen as an effort to ensure sector-specific protections for domestic workers, domestic work-specific laws don't tend to afford domestic workers the same rights and protection as other workers, and domestic workers receive less favorable entitlements. There's also some really big changes happening right now in East Asia. Economies are rapidly aging and having to open up to migrant care workers for the first time. And so a few countries are opening up their immigration rules, relaxing restrictions, and having to figure out what labor laws will cover incoming migrant domestic workers. Unfortunately, in some places, discourse is looking quite bad, with countries wanting to emulate other countries in the region like Hong Kong and Singapore that have quite low pay for domestic workers. So in the Republic of Korea, there are newly announced plans to bring in domestic workers to work for lower wages than nationals. Domestic worker organizations there are pretty vocal against this. In Southeast Asia, trade union organizing for domestic workers remains restricted in policy. Some places the restriction isn't about domestic workers, but is about migrants. So restrictions saying migrants can't become leaders of a union or migrants can't join unions. And in countries where domestic workers are almost exclusively migrants, the effect is the same, that it's impossible for domestic workers to organize into unions. Domestic workers also have really practical barriers to organizing, so time poverty, inability to leave the households they're living and working in, low wages, leading to a low capacity to pay union dues, low awareness among unions about the rights of domestic workers as workers. And then there's also the labor intensiveness that it takes for unions to organize domestic workers one worker at a time, one workplace at a time, because workers are quite isolated working in different households.
Wow. So what would you mentioned a lot of, say, bad laws, like where there are no minimum wages, there are restrictions on maximum hours or restrictions on migrant workers moving about. So could you tell us if there are any examples of good laws or good policies that are there for domestic workers in some of these countries?
I already mentioned the Philippines adopted comprehensive legislation for domestic workers in 2013 after they ratified the convention. And the Philippines really shines in the region. I mentioned before that Malaysia has Social Security inclusion for domestic workers, including migrants. We just had a great meeting with Malaysia's Social Security Office and domestic workers there in June to see how more domestic workers could be reached for inclusion, and maybe also how more benefits within Social Security could be extended. Malaysia also has committed in its National Action Plan on Forced Labor to consider adoption of the minimum wage order for domestic workers. Um, and this comes on the back of ratification of the ILO Forced Labor Protocol. So sometimes we can use other conventions besides C189 to push for rights for domestic workers. In Singapore, there's a couple of really good practices there. So domestic workers do have to have health insurance. There's compulsory training for first-time employers and first-time domestic workers. And Singapore last year started follow-ups with migrant domestic workers on their first year in their first year within Singapore. So making sure that somebody checks in with them at the first in the first months of first year. In January this year, there was also policy change in Singapore, ensuring that employers must give domestic workers 1 day off a month. So while domestic workers are due 1 day off every week, there's a regulation that this can be compensated. So that employers can ask domestic workers to work on their Sunday off and pay them for that, which in some cases meant in practice that people were never getting a day off. So now they really have to get at least one of those Sundays off per month. In Thailand, there's quite a lot more flexibility for domestic workers, and I think the this uh, flexibility in policy means that domestic workers have quite a bit more freedom. So living in is not required where it is in Singapore and Malaysia, nor is an employer paid levy. So in Singapore and Malaysia, there's a tax to employ a domestic worker. Thailand has a draft to reform a ministerial regulation on domestic work that, if passed, would allow inclusion um, in minimum wage, hours, and maternity leave regulations. So that would be really good if that happens in Thailand, and hopefully that's on the horizon coming up.
And what would you say about once these laws are in place? Because the domestic worker sector is so unique, like workers work in private homes, they are scattered across the city or town. So, have you seen or heard about what are some of the practical challenges that countries face where they actually sort of start implementing these policies or laws?
Let me talk about two kind of challenges that I've heard recently, which are challenges to both pass a law and then to implement. So the first is that employers do want domestic workers to work more than 8 hours. And right now, this is normal practice. And there's concern that care needs of a country won't be met if instead of one person working and on standby for 24 hours to care for a terminally ill person or a baby, so instead of this work around the clock, there would need to be uh, 3 people doing 3 8-hour shifts, which becomes a hugely different prospect in terms of how costly that is, as well as shifts the live in arrangement within a household, because making room for three people or allowing three people to live out is a different setup than many countries have now. And the issue about standby hours is pretty clear within C189. So standby hours are hours when a worker cannot freely leave and do what they want, and these should be paid and count as work hours. But there are arguments here that these aren't working hours, and any regulation of hours in the sector means defining standby hours and potentially running afoul of C189. And another sticky point that tends to be talked about is around labor inspection. And there are worries that if a workplace can't be inspected, then it can't be governed. So there's this logic that laws shouldn't be put in place if they aren't enforceable. And however, this is a bit of a tautological kind of circular excuse. The ILO has done a lot of work showing that methods of inspection are possible. And in any case, non-inspection doesn't negate that domestic workers are workers like any other worker and need protections and need to be included within labor laws.
So we've talked about a lot of these grim laws and very bare minimum laws that are there and restrictions on organizing across Asia. So what do you think if we could have a more ideal world? What are the sort of key shifts that needs to happen for domestic workers' rights to be realized? And what have you seen are some of the upcoming opportunities for change in these areas?
So as I've been kind of alluding to in previous answers to questions you've asked me, is that full inclusion is in labor laws is really a must. And a change is needed in mindset to get to a norm where societies think that and really believe that all workers deserve 8-hour days, minimum wage, and rest. And to get to a norm where societies think and agree that care economies need shoring up through public funding, and realizing that current practices of um, caring for members of society through domestic workers working long hours and for low pay um, are exploitative ways to meet the care needs of a country. In Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, formal care systems really are not well developed. Um, and then domestic work becomes essential to the delivery of care. But it's on an unequal basis where more well-off families can afford it and less well-off families need to quit jobs to be able to meet care needs within their households. Um, a recent study found that on average, within three main destination countries in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, on average, 62% of domestic workers are doing direct care work, and 99% are doing indirect care work, the cooking and cleaning. And when we looked at what tasks people are doing, we are able to measure against the international standard classification of occupations that domestic workers are doing medium skilled work, and that the care work that they're undertaking is medium skilled. In the pandemic, we as societies came to a place of recognizing that care work is essential. And our study showed that it's also skilled. So we have skilled and essential workers, but workers that are continuing to work in poor conditions. We saw in this same study that domestic workers are reporting conditions that meet the ILO's definition of forced labor on a pretty high rate. So it was 29% in Malaysia, 7% in Singapore, and 4% in Thailand. And I've shifted a little bit in this last answer to talk about care work more specifically. And I think upcoming on the horizon, the care work discussion is our opportunity to make some changes. So the 112th International Labour Congress next year in 2024 will include a general discussion on decent work and the care economy. And after COVID, as I was saying, there really is new attention being placed on care work. And we've been advocating that in care discussions at national levels and at global levels, that domestic workers need to be represented. And that their working conditions and even their own care needs for their families need to be centered in global agendas.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Rebecca, and for giving us these valuable insights. It's incredulous how we still have so little in terms of legal protection for domestic workers, despite the essential role they play in providing care for the old and the young. I hope that Asia sees many more ratifications, the full inclusion of domestic workers in labor laws, and real changes in their lives as a result of this. And a big thank you for listening, all of you. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode. We've linked some resources in the description for those listeners who want to know more about how majority of domestic workers in Asia still lack legal rights and protections. In the upcoming episodes, we learn about what's happening at the country level, including some of the examples that Rebecca touched on today. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
A Sonologue production.